Carl Jung exposes the shadow behind every energy vampire. Have you ever walked away from someone feeling completely exhausted and you didn't even argue? What if the real reason isn't them, but the unconscious part of you that keeps giving your energy away? Carl Jung knew exactly why this happens, and today, we're going deep. Part 1, Carl Jung's concept of psychic energy, understanding why you feel drained around certain people. Carl Jung's concept of energy was radically different from the materialistic views of modern psychology. For Jung, libido was not simply a term tied to sexual desire as Freud suggested. Instead, it was the essential psychic energy, life force itself that fuels our thoughts, motivations, emotions, and spiritual growth. When we talk about people who drain our energy, we are, from Jung's perspective, referring to a psychic transaction that goes beyond mere emotional fatigue. It reflects a deeper dysfunction in how our psychic energy is managed, protected, and exchanged. Jung's theory of psychic energy. Jung proposed that the psyche is energized by this libido, which can manifest in multiple forms: creativity, passion, spirituality, ambition, or relationships. This energy flows within a dynamic system composed of various elements of the psyche: conscious ego, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious. The more integrated and self-aware an individual is, the more they can contain and use this energy wisely. Conversely, individuals who are fragmented, unconscious of their inner world, or overly dependent on others, often draw energy from those around them. Jung considered this energy vampirism a byproduct of unresolved internal conflict and lack of individuation. Some people are energy drains not because they are malicious, but because they are psychologically incomplete. They are, in Jungian terms, possessed by unconscious forces, particularly their own rejected aspects, the shadow. Projection and emotional vampirism. One of the most important concepts Jung gave us is projection. Projection occurs when an individual attributes their own unconscious feelings, desires, or traits to someone else. This is not just a mental error. It is a psychic defense mechanism to avoid confronting one's own inner shadow. Here's how it ties into energy drain: when someone projects their inner wounds onto you, blaming you, making you responsible for their unhappiness, seeking your attention to validate their worth. They are essentially using you as a mirror for their unconscious. They latch onto your energy field to stabilize their own fragmented self. In a relationship based on heavy projection, one person inevitably becomes the container for the other's emotional instability. You begin to feel emotionally burdened, mentally foggy, and inexplicably exhausted. Your psychic energy is being siphoned to maintain a dynamic that is psychologically toxic. Jung believed that the inability to see and reclaim projections leads to parasitic emotional bonds. The person who drains your energy is not just taking your attention, they're feeding on your unconscious willingness to be used as a vessel. Identification and the loss of boundaries. Another key Jungian insight is the process of identification. When two psyches are engaged in a deep dynamic, such as a romantic relationship or an emotionally intense friendship, there is often a fusion of energies. This can lead to mutual empowerment, but it can also lead to depletion if one person dominates or manipulates the connection. If you have not developed a strong ego, that is, a clear sense of self, you become vulnerable to losing your identity in others. Jung saw this as a regressive tendency, a return to a pre-individuated state where you don't know where you end and another begins. This confusion opens the door to energetic exploitation. For instance, if someone constantly demands your emotional support, and you respond not out of love, but from a compulsion to be needed, you are not relating authentically. You are merging into the other's psychic space, losing your personal boundaries. This is precisely the condition Jung warned about. A person stuck in unconscious identification is easy prey for those who are emotionally needy, manipulative, or narcissistic. Over time, these blurred boundaries erode your psychic integrity. You feel drained not because you're giving too much, but because you are losing your center. Jung believed that individuation, becoming a whole and self-aware individual, was the antidote to this problem. Psychic inflation and energetic imbalance. Jung described a state called psychic inflation, where a person becomes over-identified with certain archetypes or complexes. For example, someone who sees themselves as a martyr or a savior might feel compelled to help others at all costs, even at their own expense. While this may appear altruistic on the surface, it often leads to codependency and emotional exhaustion. In these scenarios, the person who is helping is actually being drained because they are living out an unconscious script. They are inflating their ego with a false sense of moral superiority. But behind the scenes, their psychic energy is leaking. The person being saved may reinforce this by unconsciously playing the role of the victim, feeding off the savior's need for validation. Jung would say that both parties are stuck in archetypal possession. They are no longer individuals interacting consciously, but characters in an unconscious play. The result? Energetic depletion, emotional fatigue, and psychic confusion. This dynamic is especially common in empathic individuals who haven't done their shadow work. They may feel it's their duty to heal others, but what they are actually doing is enabling dysfunction while draining their own life force. The collective unconscious and social energy drains. Beyond personal relationships, Jung also explored how collective dynamics can drain individual energy. The collective unconscious is filled with archetypes, universal symbols, and motifs that influence our behavior. In modern society, we are often unconsciously caught in collective complexes, consumerism, groupthink, tribalism, and mass hysteria. When you find yourself exhausted after scrolling social media, attending a crowded event, or engaging in ideological debates, what you're experiencing is psychic fatigue due to collective contamination. Your energy is being fragmented by unconscious engagement with the collective psyche. Jung believed that to remain psychologically healthy, one must learn to separate their individuality from the collective. Otherwise, the constant psychic noise of society acts like a background current, slowly draining your vitality. The fear of not belonging, the need to prove your worth, and the unconscious desire for external validation. All of these are traps of the collective archetypes. This is why introverted or spiritually sensitive individuals often feel chronically tired. They are overly attuned to the psychic noise around them. Jung would say they must withdraw periodically into solitude to recover their own center. Emotional contagion and psychic resonance. One of the most fascinating aspects of Jung's work is his understanding of synchronicity and resonance. He believed that individuals operate on vibrational frequencies, what we call vibes today. When two people come into contact, their psychic fields interact. If someone has a chaotic or toxic inner world, they emit a psychic resonance that destabilizes others. This emotional contagion is not visible, but it's deeply felt. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt tension, sadness, or anger? Even though no words were spoken, that's psychic resonance. Jung suggested that these energetic fields are real and impactful, even if they are not measurable by science. When you spend prolonged time with people who carry heavy, unresolved trauma or repressed emotions, your own psyche begins to absorb their chaos. It's as if their psychic field hijacks yours, especially if you are emotionally porous. Over time, your energy system gets overloaded, and you feel like you're carrying burdens that are not your own. Unless you have strong psychological defenses, clear boundaries, self-awareness, shadow integration, you will inevitably become drained. Jung's solution: strengthen the self. Anchor your consciousness so deeply within that you can engage with others without being psychically invaded. Part 2: the unconscious people who drain your energy. Carl Jung's warning about psychic immaturity. According to Carl Jung, many people who drain your energy are not consciously evil or malicious. Instead, they are what he would call psychically immature. These individuals are often completely unaware of the unconscious forces driving their behaviors. They haven't developed a relationship with their inner world. As a result, they unconsciously seek others to supply the psychic energy they lack within themselves. These are not just people with bad habits or negative attitudes. Jung believed that people who have not confronted their shadow, who have not engaged in the process of individuation, live in a fragmented psychic state. And in this fragmentation, they become emotional parasites without realizing it. The psychology of psychic immaturity. Jung emphasized that a key part of becoming psychologically whole involves integrating both the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. This includes confronting the shadow, dealing with personal trauma, and becoming aware of one's projections and complexes. But most people don't do this work. They drift through life reacting instead of reflecting, blaming instead of owning, and attaching to others instead of grounding themselves. Jung referred to this as living in the persona, where the outer mask takes precedence over inner awareness. These individuals operate from surface-level identities, roles they have inherited or adapted to survive, but lack any real depth. Because of this, they unconsciously turn to others for validation, attention, emotional labor, and psychic nourishment. They don't know how to create or regulate their own inner stability, so they instinctively feed off the energy of those who do. They're not bad people, but they are energetically dangerous. The archetype of the victim and emotional dependency. One of the most common manifestations of this psychic immaturity is the victim archetype. Jung spoke often about archetypes' universal patterns within the collective unconscious that shape human experience. The victim archetype, in its shadow form, is deeply draining. People embodying the victim archetype often present as helpless, perpetually unlucky, or constantly suffering. They cling to others in order to receive sympathy, validation, and attention. But here's the catch: no matter how much you give, it's never enough. These individuals don't want solutions. They want your presence. They want your psychic availability, and they want it unconditionally. What makes this so exhausting is that your compassion becomes a one-way street. You are constantly being pulled into their emotional spiral without any return. They don't develop. They don't take responsibility. They simply transfer their emotional weight onto you. And over time, you start to lose your vitality. Jung warned against relationships that become mutual shadow dances, where one person unconsciously feeds off the other's need to fix, help, or save. You are not helping them. You are enabling their unconscious dependency. The narcissistic wound and ego inflation. Another category of energy-draining individuals stems from what Jung called inflated ego states, especially those covering deep narcissistic wounds. Narcissistic individuals are often trapped in a grandiose self-image, but underneath lies an injured inner child. Rather than face their own emptiness or self-doubt, they unconsciously demand admiration, attention, and dominance. They need others to reflect back a fantasy version of themselves, and they use manipulation, often through charm, guilt, or intimidation to get what they want. Jung saw this as a defense mechanism against psychic fragmentation. The narcissist cannot bear to face the disintegration of their inner world, so they construct a false self and siphon psychic energy from others to keep it alive. If you've ever walked away from a conversation with someone feeling inexplicably depleted, like you were emotionally used but can't quite explain why, chances are you interacted with an inflated ego. Jung believed the more inflated the persona, the weaker the actual self, and weak selves feed on strong ones. These people draw others into their orbit like gravity wells. At first, you might feel flattered or useful, but over time, the imbalance becomes unbearable. They take, you give, and when you stop giving, they punish, guilt trip, or discard you. Repression and the shadow exploding outward. Jung taught that what is not brought to consciousness comes back as fate. Many energy-draining people are repressing huge parts of their psyche: anger, fear, shame, insecurity, and instead of integrating those parts, they leak them onto others. For instance, someone who has repressed rage might constantly provoke arguments, needing you to carry the anger they are too afraid to own. Someone who has repressed grief may create drama or chaos in relationships to avoid sitting in emotional stillness. Their unconscious drives them to keep the environment around them as chaotic as their inner world. You become their emotional ground wire, absorbing and discharging the tension they can't manage. They may not even be aware they're doing it, but that doesn't stop the effect it has on your nervous system. Jung emphasized that projection is automatic until it is made conscious. If someone cannot own their inner demons, they'll unconsciously look for someone else to host them. That someone is often you, the complainer, the victim, the martyr. all share one thing: unconsciousness. Across all the types, whether it's the perpetual victim, the narcissist mom, the complainer, or the passive-aggressive martyr, Jung would say they all have a common root. They are not individuated. They are not in touch with the self, the deep center of the psyche where wholeness resides. Instead, they operate from fragmented pieces of the personality wounds, fears, masks, and roles. And to sustain this fragmented identity, they need energy from the outside, from you. This is not just emotional codependency, it's energetic vampirism. And it doesn't require physical closeness. Even digital interactions, constant texts, or emotional storytelling can drain your psychic reserves if you're constantly having to hold space for someone who won't do their own inner work. Jung believed that psychic immaturity is contagious. If you stay around these people too long, you begin to adopt their emotional reality. You start to shrink. You doubt yourself. You lose clarity. Why? Because their unconscious psyche is stronger than your conscious defenses. Unless you are deeply grounded, these energy dynamics can override your awareness and hijack your identity. The cost of psychic absorption. Carl Jung warned repeatedly about losing oneself in the energies of others. Psychic absorption happens when your boundaries collapse, not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. You begin to absorb moods, thoughts, and emotional burdens that are not your own. You begin to lose your center. This doesn't just lead to fatigue. It leads to spiritual dissociation, where your soul begins to detach from your lived experience because it is too burdened by external weight. This is why Jung's process of individuation, of integrating the shadow and reclaiming the self, is not just spiritual, it's essential. Without it, you're not just tired, you're psychically endangered. Part 3, the shadow self. The hidden force behind energetic drain in human relationships. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, one of the most powerful and often misunderstood concepts is the shadow. The shadow represents all the unconscious parts of ourselves that we deny, reject, or disown. These are not necessarily evil or dangerous traits. Rather, they are the pieces of our psyche that we were conditioned to hide in order to be accepted by family, society, or culture. What makes the shadow so dangerous is not its content, but its invisibility. As long as these unconscious fragments remain buried, they hold power over us. Jung emphasized that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And nowhere is this more evident than in relationships with people who drain our energy. Some people suck the life out of you not because they are evil, but because they activate your own unresolved shadow. In trying to avoid them, fix them, or change them, you're really trying to escape the disowned parts of yourself. The mirror effect, why energy draining people trigger you. Many people wonder, why does this specific person make me feel so exhausted, so anxious, or so angry? According to Jung, the answer lies not in the other person's behavior alone, but in what they reflect back to you about your own psyche. Every person you interact with is a potential mirror for your inner world. When someone triggers you deeply, when their mere presence creates emotional chaos or energetic fatigue, it's a sign that something unconscious is being activated. You're not just responding to who they are, you're responding to the shadow they represent in you. For example, if someone is overly controlling and it drains you, ask yourself, where in your life are you suppressing your own desire for control? If someone is selfish and you feel used, ask, are you repressing your own needs to appear selfless? If someone constantly plays the victim and you feel the urge to rescue or run away, ask, do you secretly fear being helpless yourself? Jung said, we project our shadow onto others when we haven't done the inner work of owning it. The more unaware you are of your shadow, the more power energy-draining people will have over you because they unconsciously reflect the parts of yourself you have not accepted. Shadow projection and psychic enmeshment. When two people come together in relationship, whether romantic, platonic, or familial, there's always a dynamic of energy exchange. But when one or both people are unaware of their shadow, the relationship becomes fertile ground for projection, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. Here's how the cycle typically works. One person unconsciously projects a disowned quality onto the other, e.g., you're so aggressive.
Nah.
2. The other person reacts emotionally to that accusation, often defensively or submissively. 3. This triggers a power imbalance. One person becomes the drainer, and the other becomes the drained. Or instead of setting boundaries or seeking clarity, both people remain caught in the loop of unconscious enactment. This is not always obvious. Often, these interactions happen through subtle emotional cues, guilt tripping, passive aggression, or even silent withdrawal. But the result is the same psychic entanglement. And the person who is more emotionally aware usually ends up carrying the psychic burden of the other. Jung warned about this form of psychic possession, where you become an emotional puppet in someone else's unresolved trauma play. You think you're being kind or patient, but really, you're just unconsciously acting out their shadow script. How the repressed shadow makes you a magnet for energetic drainers. The more you suppress your own anger, fear, sadness, or ambition, the more likely you are to attract people who embody those exact traits in excess. Jung believed the psyche is always seeking wholeness. So, if you've rejected a part of yourself, the universe or your unconscious will send someone into your life to embody that part. This is why people who have been taught to be good, kind, selfless, or nice often find themselves surrounded by manipulators, narcissists, or emotional vampires. Their kindness is real, but it's also a mask. Beneath it lies rage, resentment, and exhaustion. And because they refuse to confront their shadow, they attract those who will do it for them through pain, drama, or betrayal. You are energetically drawn to the very thing you refuse to admit lives within you. This is not your fault. It is the psyche's way of trying to heal itself. But if you remain unaware of this dynamic, you will continue to attract and be drained by the same types of people over and over until you confront the root issue, your own shadow. The shadow in the other, recognizing when you're the target of someone else's disowned self. Just as you can project your shadow onto others, others can project their shadow onto you. This is often what happens when someone constantly criticizes, blames, or scapegoats you. They are offloading their own self-hatred, guilt, or insecurity onto you, hoping to cleanse themselves of it by making you the problem. In these cases, you may feel chronically misunderstood or mischaracterized, emotionally manipulated or guilt-tripped, constantly walking on eggshells, like you're being punished for things that aren't your fault. Jung called this shadow projection in its most toxic form. It's psychic abuse. And if you absorb these projections instead of deflecting them, you start to internalize the other person's shadow. You become what they accuse you of. You shrink, doubt yourself, and lose energy trying to prove your innocence or win their approval. The only solution, Jung said, is to individuate, to strengthen your sense of self so deeply that you no longer accept others' projections as your truth. The double drain, when two unintegrated shadows collide. Sometimes, the most draining relationships are not one-sided. They are symbiotic. Both people are operating from shadow, each feeding the other's unconscious wounds, and the result is mutual devastation. Examples include a codependent empath who needs to be needed, paired with a narcissist who needs constant validation. A fixer who thrives on rescuing others, paired with a perpetual victim who refuses to grow. A repressed person paired with an explosive partner who acts out all the rage the other cannot express. These relationships are not just emotionally toxic, they are spiritually depleting. They drain your energy, not because one person is evil, but because both people are unconscious. The shadow runs the show, and until one person wakes up, the cycle continues. Jung described these relationships as alchemical vessels, dangerous but potentially transformative. If one person begins to do the inner work, owning their projections, confronting their shadow, they can break the cycle. But only if they are willing to step out of the pattern, even if that means ending the relationship. Turning shadow awareness into power. The good news: your exhaustion is a clue, your triggers are a guide, your pain is the starting point. Every time someone drains your energy, you are being given an opportunity to ask, What part of me is being reflected right now? What feeling am I trying to avoid by staying in this dynamic? What have I not accepted in myself that this person embodies? Jung believed that the path to wholeness is not about eliminating the shadow, but integrating it. That means you learn to own your anger, your boundaries, your desires, your voice. You stop playing the role of martyr or victim and start standing in your authentic self. Once you do that, you'll stop attracting the same draining dynamics. You'll recognize energy vampires for what they are, mirrors of your past self. And you'll walk away not from a place of fear, but from a place of power. Part 4, the rescuer complex. How trying to help people can destroy your energy. Carl Jung deeply understood the unconscious motivations that drive human behavior, especially when we think we're helping others. One of the most insidious energy-draining patterns in relationships is what Jungian analysts call the rescuer complex. On the surface, it looks like compassion, it feels like empathy, but underneath, it's often a disguised form of ego inflation, shadow projection, or unresolved trauma. When you consistently feel drawn to people who are broken, needy, lost, or chaotic, and you feel a compulsive need to fix them, you are likely operating under the archetype of the rescuer. And as Jung would warn, this pattern is not just emotionally exhausting, it's spiritually toxic. The archetype of the rescuer and its shadow. In Jungian theory, archetypes are ancient psychic patterns that live in the collective unconscious. They are instinctual modes of being that express themselves in thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. One of the most common archetypes is the rescuer or the hero. On the light side, this archetype gives us the courage to stand up for others, to protect the weak, and to act with moral strength. But every archetype has a shadow side. When the rescuer is not balanced with self-awareness and boundaries, it becomes self-destructive. It begins to rescue not from compassion, but from a compulsive need to be needed, and that's when it turns into a trap. The shadow rescuer doesn't save people because they're strong. They save people to feel worthy. They believe, unconsciously, if I can heal you, then I matter. This makes them extremely vulnerable to energy drainers because they're constantly giving from an empty cup. The savior-victim trap, the emotional codependency loop. Jung would often observe this dynamic in therapy sessions. One person unconsciously adopts the savior role, and the other becomes the perpetual victim. It feels noble at first, but over time, it turns into emotional slavery. The victim never grows. They complain, cry, and self-destruct, but never take true responsibility. And the rescuer, desperate to help, pours more and more energy into the abyss, hoping that this time will be the breakthrough. It never comes, because this relationship is not built on healing, it's built on mutual unconsciousness. The rescuer avoids their own pain by focusing on someone else's. The victim avoids their responsibility by leaning on someone else's energy. Jung called this dynamic mutual projection, where each person is projecting their own shadow onto the other. The victim projects their fear of power and independence onto the rescuer. The rescuer projects their disowned helplessness onto the victim. Both are trapped in roles that exhaust the psyche and prevent growth. And the one who feels the drain most, the rescuer. Martyrdom as a defense against inner emptiness. Many rescuers come from childhoods where they had to care for emotionally unstable parents, siblings, or authority figures. Jung believed the psyche compensates for childhood trauma by creating adaptive identities. One of the most common is the martyr, the person who believes they must suffer for others. This is not conscious. It lives deep in the unconscious. You may tell yourself you're just a kind person or just trying to help. But if you consistently end up exhausted or broken by others' problems, there's a deeper pattern at play. Here's what Jung might say. You are trying to save others because you couldn't save yourself as a child. You overextend emotionally because you fear being abandoned or unloved. You don't set boundaries because you equate love with sacrifice. These beliefs keep you locked in cycles where your energy is constantly depleted, yet you feel guilty for stepping back. This is the martyr's curse to serve others endlessly, while slowly eroding the self. Jung's warning is clear: if you do not confront this pattern, you will not only lose your energy, you will lose your identity. Helping versus healing, understanding the difference. One of Jung's greatest contributions was the idea that true healing cannot be imposed from the outside. The psyche must go through its own process of transformation. What does that mean in relationships? You cannot heal someone who is not ready to face themselves. You can support them, you can love them, but you cannot do their inner work for them. The rescuer often crosses this line. They try to give advice, provide solutions, offer emotional labor, assuming that if they just do enough, the other person will change. But Jung's psychology says otherwise. Unless the individual is willing to enter into a conscious relationship with their own shadow, all external help is a bandage, not a cure. And the longer you stay in that role, the more drained, resentful, and spiritually depleted you become. Helping comes from a place of strength. Healing someone else without invitation comes from ego. Jung would encourage you to ask, am I supporting this person's growth or enabling their dysfunction? Am I giving because I want to or because I feel guilty if I don't? Does helping them energize me or exhaust me? If the answer is exhaustion, it's time to step back. Energetic enmeshment in the loss of self. When you rescue others habitually, your psychic boundaries begin to dissolve. You stop knowing where you end and the other begins. Jung would say that your ego, the center of your conscious identity, gets fused with someone else's emotional chaos. This is called energetic enmeshment. You feel everything they feel. You take on their problems. You carry their pain as if it were your own. At first, this feels like empathy, but over time, it becomes psychic contamination. You're not loving them, you're losing yourself. This fusion is dangerous. It prevents both people from evolving. The rescuer remains emotionally overinvested, while the other remains emotionally underdeveloped. And the longer this pattern continues, the harder it is to untangle. You may even begin to believe that your only value is in how much you can give, that if you set boundaries, people will leave, that you must always say yes even when your soul is screaming no. Jung would say that the cure is individuation, the process of separating from these false roles and returning to the self. Becoming conscious of the rescuer complex. To break free from the rescuer trap, you must first become aware that it exists within you. Jung believed that awareness itself begins the healing process. Here are signs that you may be stuck in this pattern. You feel responsible for other people's emotions. You feel guilty when you say no. You attract people who are constantly in crisis. You feel drained after conversations, but blame yourself for being too sensitive. You fear being irrelevant or useless if you're not helping someone. If these resonate, the path forward is not more giving, it's more boundaries. Jung would guide you inward. He would ask you to confront the wounded child within you who equates love with sacrifice. He would ask you to reclaim your right to rest, to say no, to let people grow on their own terms. Because when you heal your inner rescuer, you stop trying to save people and you start inspiring them to save themselves. And most importantly, you stop hemorrhaging your energy in relationships that are not built on mutual respect, but on unconscious trauma bonding. Part 5, identification and the collapse of psychic boundaries when you lose yourself in others. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, one of the most damaging and draining phenomena is what he called identification. Identification is the unconscious merging of your identity with another person, archetype, or emotional state. In healthy relationships, two people maintain individual boundaries while emotionally connecting. But when identification happens, the lines blur, you lose track of where you end and the other begins. When you're identified with someone else, especially someone who is emotionally unstable, toxic, or chaotic, you don't just care for them, you become them. You take on their moods, mirror their energy, internalize their problems. And before long, your own psychic structure begins to dissolve. Jung saw this dynamic as spiritually and psychologically devastating. It is one of the core reasons some people drain you, not because they take your energy forcefully, but because you unconsciously surrender it. The ego and the need for psychic boundaries. In Jungian psychology, the ego represents your conscious sense of self, your I. It's not your full identity, but it serves as the organizing center for your waking awareness. The ego needs boundaries. It helps you differentiate your thoughts from others, your emotions from others, and your path from others. But many people, especially empaths, people pleasers, and those with unresolved trauma, have weak or permeable egos. They lack the firm psychological container that allows them to withstand the pressure of other people's energy. So when they enter into intense relationships, romantic, familial, or even friendships, they unconsciously fuse with the other person. They feel what the other feels. They think what the other thinks. They carry burdens that aren't theirs. This loss of ego boundary is what Jung referred to as psychic regression, a falling back into a pre-individuated state where selfhood is not fully developed. It is from this regressed state that people become vulnerable to energetic exploitation. The signs of psychic identification. Psychic identification is not always dramatic. It can be subtle, creeping in over time until one day you wake up and realize you no longer feel like yourself. Here are some signs that you're identified with another person's psychic energy. You feel responsible for their happiness, success, or emotions. You change your behavior, values, or priorities to avoid upsetting them. You feel drained after being around them, but can't explain why. You find yourself thinking about them obsessively, even when they're not present. You struggle to make independent decisions because you've internalized their judgment or expectations. Jung would say that in these moments, your ego has been hijacked by the emotional gravity of another's unconscious psyche. This can happen with narcissists, victims, or even seemingly normal people who carry unresolved trauma. In each case, what they lack in psychic wholeness, they compensate for by merging with yours. The unholy merge, when two shadows fuse. One of the most destructive dynamics in any relationship is when both people unconsciously identify with each other's shadows. Jung observed this in what he called the unanimous possession, a situation where a man or woman becomes captivated, even obsessed, by the unconscious image of the ideal partner. This possession bypasses conscious awareness. You think you're in love. You think it's destiny. But what's really happening is this: your shadow sees in the other person a missing piece of your own psyche. Instead of working inwardly to integrate it, you project it onto them and emotionally fuse with the fantasy. These unholy merges are often intense, passionate, even addictive, but deeply draining. The reason? Because you're not in a relationship with the real person. You're in relationship with a projected part of yourself. They, in turn, are doing the same thing. Both parties lose their individuality, boundaries collapse, and psychic entanglement becomes inevitable. And once you are psychically entangled with someone's unconscious, especially their unhealed wounds, you begin to carry their energy in your nervous system. Their sadness becomes yours. Their anxiety lives in your body. Their chaos leaks into your life. And the more you try to save them, the more identified you become with their brokenness. Jung would call this a neurosis of identity, where your self has been compromised by the false belief that you are responsible for someone else's psychic development. Trauma bonding and emotional fusion. Identification is especially powerful in relationships that involve trauma bonding. Jung didn't use this exact term, but his theory of complexes explains it perfectly. A complex is a cluster of emotionally charged experiences stored in the unconscious. These can include feelings of abandonment, shame, fear, or betrayal often formed in childhood. When two people with unresolved complexes meet, their unconscious minds recognize each other instantly. The relationship might feel fated or magnetic, but what's really happening is a reactivation of old wounds. You don't fall in love, you fall into a pattern. You're not connecting, you're reenacting. In this kind of relationship, you become so deeply identified with the other person that you lose your autonomy. You can't tell where your trauma ends and theirs begins, and the more fused you become, the more energetically drained you feel, not just tired but hollow. Because what's being exchanged in these bonds isn't love, it's unresolved pain. Jung's warning when identification becomes possession. Jung warned that when identification is left unchecked, it becomes possession. You are no longer living from yourself, you are being lived by a pattern. You say things you don't mean. You feel things that aren't yours. You act out roles that were written for you by someone else's unconscious. This is what makes some relationships feel haunted. It's as if you're stuck in a script that you can't rewrite, a role you can't leave. Jung would say you're possessed by an unconscious archetype, and the person you're fused with is possessed too. The result is mutual psychic imprisonment. Both people lose themselves in each other, and both suffer from chronic energetic depletion because there's no longer a self in the relationship, only a drama being unconsciously reenacted. This is how many people wake up years into a relationship wondering, who am I anymore? It's not just emotional confusion, it's psychic amnesia. The price of prolonged identification is the erosion of individuality. Reclaiming your energy through de-identification. The first step to healing is de-identification. Jungian therapy focuses heavily on separating the self from the roles, projections, and emotional entanglements that keep us bound to others. This doesn't mean cutting people off emotionally, but it does mean cutting off the unconscious psychic cords that bind you. Start by asking, what part of me have I given away to this person? What emotion am I carrying that may not be mine? Where have I lost my voice, my needs, my truth in this relationship? Jung believed that awareness is the most powerful antidote to unconscious possession. The moment you name the dynamic, you start breaking its spell. You don't have to confront the person immediately. You don't need to fix the relationship overnight, but you must begin to reclaim your inner boundaries. This may involve journaling your own thoughts separate from theirs, spending time alone to rediscover your core desires, noticing when you shift your mood based on their emotional state, practicing saying no without guilt or explanation. Every act of recentering is an act of psychic protection. And as you reclaim your individuality, you'll notice something remarkable. The people who once drained you begin to lose their hold over you. You feel lighter, clearer, more grounded. Not because they changed, but because you stopped unconsciously merging with their emotional chaos. You are no longer identified. You are no longer possessed. You are finally, quietly, free. Part 6, Trauma Bonds in the Unconscious Wounds That Attract Energy Drainers. Carl Jung emphasized that most of what governs our behaviors is unconscious. Beneath our choices, preferences, and relationships lies a complex network of unhealed wounds, archetypes, and psychological blueprints shaped by early life experiences. Among the most powerful forces in this network is what modern psychology calls the core wound, a deeply buried emotional trauma that silently dictates who we're drawn to, how we interact, and why we remain in relationships that deplete us. In Jungian terms, this is a manifestation of the complex, a charged constellation of feelings, memories, and expectations organized around a psychic wound. And when your complex resonates with someone else's unconscious pattern, you experience what seems like instant connection. But it's not love, it's trauma bonding. And it's a primary reason some people will endlessly drain your energy because they represent an unresolved pain you haven't faced yet. The complex, Jung's framework for unconscious attraction. To understand why we attract draining people, we must first understand the Jungian idea of a complex. Jung defined a complex as an emotionally charged bundle of memories and associations that live in the unconscious and influence behavior. You don't think a complex, it thinks you. It gets triggered in relationships, stress, or conflict and causes you to react irrationally or compulsively. For example, a rejection complex formed in childhood may cause you to pursue emotionally unavailable partners. An abandonment complex may drive you to overgive in relationships, hoping no one leaves. A shame complex may make you tolerate verbal or emotional abuse because you secretly believe you deserve it. When someone comes into your life and triggers your complex, you feel magnetized toward them, not because they are right for you, but because their energy aligns with your unresolved wound. The dynamic feels familiar. It feels intense. And it drains you, because instead of relating from your conscious self, you're acting from a psychological wound. Trauma chemistry, when the nervous system confuses danger with love. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances if there is any reaction. Both are transformed. But when that reaction is based on unhealed trauma, the transformation becomes toxic. In trauma bonding, your nervous system mistakes intensity for intimacy. You feel alive, seen, or high around the other person not because of spiritual alignment, but because they mirror an unresolved pattern from childhood. That emotional intensity is actually your unconscious screaming for resolution. But because the wound is unhealed, you keep revisiting it through them. You may say, I just can't quit this person. They exhaust me, but I feel addicted. I've never felt this kind of connection before. And it's true, you have never felt it because you've never had a chance to process this wound before. This person gives you that chance, but instead of healing it, you keep re-experiencing it. And every time you do, it drains you psychically, emotionally, spiritually. The role of the inner child in energy-draining attachments. At the heart of every trauma bond is a wounded inner child. Jung emphasized the importance of reconnecting with this inner child because the child holds the key to your complexes. When you were a child, you formed beliefs about your worth, your needs, and how safe you were to express emotion. These beliefs became the foundation of your relational life. For example, if your needs were dismissed, you may now attract takers who reinforce that you don't matter. If love was conditional, you may now overfunction to earn affection. If anger wasn't allowed, you may now attract partners who express rage for you, leaving you drained and confused. These unconscious beliefs manifest as emotional templates. So even when your adult self knows someone isn't good for you, your inner child feels bonded to them. You stay, not out of love, but out of loyalty to your wound. Jung would say your soul is seeking integration, and it's using your relationships to show you where you are not yet whole. Why you stay in draining relationships? The wound seeks repetition. One of the most perplexing parts of trauma bonding is that even when a relationship clearly drains you, you stay, Jung's answer. The wound seeks repetition not to suffer, but to heal. This is called the repetition compulsion. The psyche unconsciously recreates the original wound in hopes of a different outcome. You date someone cold and distant, hoping this time they'll finally see you. You support someone emotionally unavailable, hoping this time they'll return the care. You accept chaos, hoping one day peace will come. But it doesn't. Because healing doesn't come from recreating the wound, it comes from breaking the pattern. And that can only happen when you bring consciousness to the dynamic. Jung warned that when you ignore your inner work, your outer life becomes a repetition of your trauma. The same characters, the same outcomes, the same exhaustion until you awaken and say, no more. Energetic cord ties and the psychic drain of trauma attachment. From a metaphysical perspective, draining relationships are often sustained by energetic cords. These are invisible attachments formed when we engage deeply emotionally, sexually or spiritually with another person. When the bond is trauma-based, these cords become heavy conduits of psychic exchange. You may dream of them, feel them in your body, or be unable to stop thinking about them. Even if you haven't seen them in months, their energy lingers. Jung would interpret this as the complex still being active. The relationship may be over, but the wound it touched is still alive in you. You feel drained not because they're in your life, but because the part of you that bonded to them is still active. That part still believes you need them to feel whole. And until you tend to that part, the inner child, the wounded complex, the unmet need, you will continue to leak energy through the psychic tie. Breaking free from bondage to individuation. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming whole, is the only true path out of trauma-based attachments. Individuation does not mean becoming perfect. It means becoming aware. It means taking back your projections, owning your wounds, and integrating the parts of you that got lost in others. To break the trauma bond, Jung would invite you to explore the original wound the bond is replicating. Journal the ways this person reflects a disowned part of yourself. Allow yourself to feel the grief of unmet needs without bypassing them. Practice inner dialogue with the wounded child who is still waiting to be rescued. Release the fantasy that this person will heal what happened long ago. Because they won't, they can't. That's your work now. Not to punish yourself, but to reclaim your power, to stop hemorrhaging your psychic energy in hopes of rewriting history, to give your inner child what she never got, not through someone else, but through conscious self-parenting. Jung believed that the pain of the wound is not the enemy. The refusal to face it is, and as long as you avoid the core issue, you will attract people who activate it over and over again until you surrender to the work of integration. Healing the energy leak. You heal the energy leak not by blocking people, deleting numbers, or cutting cords alone. Although boundaries are essential, you heal by confronting the story that you needed them in the first place. You heal by realizing that your exhaustion wasn't caused by them, it was caused by your unconscious agreement to reenact an old script. Once you see that, you begin to recover not just your energy, but your identity. The draining stops, the trauma loop closes, and in its place, a deeper self emerges wiser, stronger, more whole. Part 7: Jung's Tools for Protecting Your Energy, Psychological Boundaries, Shadow Work, and Centering the Self. By the time you recognize that certain people are draining your energy, you've likely already gone through cycles of confusion, emotional exhaustion, guilt, and perhaps even trauma. Jung believed that these patterns were not random. They are deeply rooted in your unconscious, shaped by forgotten memories, unresolved pain, and archetypal forces that act behind the scenes of your awareness. So how do you reclaim your energy? According to Jung, you don't just cut people off, you evolve. You expand your consciousness. You build stronger psychological boundaries. You work with your shadow, and you become centered in the self, your truest identity. This part focuses on how to protect your energy through inner transformation, not external control, because unless you evolve internally, you will keep encountering the same draining dynamics in new forms. Reclaiming your psychic boundaries. Jung saw the ego as a container that protects the psyche. A healthy ego is not egotistical. It's grounded. It knows where you begin and where others end. Without this structure, you become psychically porous, absorbing others' moods, responsibilities, or expectations as your own. Here's what it looks like when boundaries are missing. You feel obligated to respond to everyone's emotions. You say yes when you mean no. You over-explain yourself to avoid guilt. You confuse empathy with enmeshment. You allow others to override your inner truth. To Jung, this lack of boundaries is a symptom of an undeveloped ego, a self that hasn't individuated. Boundaries are not walls. They're sacred circles that protect your energy so you can thrive. And the first step to creating them is realizing that you have a right to exist as a separate person. You are not here to be anyone's therapist, emotional sponge, or savior. Practical ways to reinforce boundaries. Practice pausing before responding emotionally. Ask yourself, is this my feeling or theirs? Don't react to guilt tripping or manipulation, observe it. Speak your limits without apology or justification. Trust your intuition when you feel heavy around someone. Boundaries aren't just behaviors, they are energetic declarations of self-worth. The power of shadow work to end energetic loops. If you don't integrate your shadow, it will sabotage your peace through the people you attract. Shadow work is the process of making the unconscious conscious, bringing light to the parts of yourself that you've denied, suppressed, or projected onto others. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This means owning your anger instead of projecting it onto others, facing your need for control instead of rescuing others compulsively, admitting your fear of abandonment rather than clinging to toxic relationships. When you repress these parts of yourself, you unconsciously attract people who act them out for you. That's why unhealed wounds pull in draining people. They mirror your disowned pain. To do shadow work, journal your emotional triggers. Ask, what part of me is being activated? Notice the traits in others that irritate you. Often, those are disowned traits within you. Reflect on the role you play in draining dynamics. Are you enabling, avoiding, or rescuing? Practice radical honesty with yourself without judgment. Shadow work isn't about blame. It's about reclaiming your energy from the unconscious scripts you've been living in. The more you integrate your shadow, the less power external people have over you. You no longer need them to mirror your inner pain because you've made peace with it. Cultivating inner authority. Stop leaking energy to external validation. Jung observed that many people feel drained because they have outsourced their sense of self. They look to others to feel worthy, safe, loved, or understood. But this leaves them vulnerable to energetic invasion. If someone praises them, they feel high. If someone disapproves, they feel low. This is energetic instability. You leak power anytime your self-worth depends on someone else's perception. Jung encouraged cultivating inner authority, a deep relationship with your inner voice, independent of social masks or external feedback. To build inner authority, spend intentional time in solitude, not to isolate, but to reconnect. Meditate or reflect on moments when you abandoned your truth to fit in. Replace people-pleasing with truth-speaking, even if your voice shakes. Reclaim your no as sacred, a sign that you honor your energy. When your identity is rooted in your authentic self, you become energetically sovereign. You're no longer pulled into others' storms. You carry your own center with you. The self, your energetic anchor amidst chaos. The ultimate protection against energy drain, Jung would argue, is the realization of the self, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and dark, wounded and whole. The self is not a role you play or a personality you manage. It is the deep, silent witness within the source of your intuition, inner knowing, and spiritual power. When you're in touch with the self, you no longer chase people who don't see your value. You don't collapse when someone withdraws their approval. You recognize draining dynamics early and step away gracefully. You walk into a room and carry presence, not just personality. Cultivating connection with the self isn't a one-time event. It's a daily practice. Ways to nurture the self. Engage in creative work art, writing, movement. Spend time in nature to recalibrate your nervous system. Listen to your dreams. Jung saw dreams as direct messages from the unconscious. Engage in spiritual practices that ground you in the present moment. When you embody the self, your energy becomes magnetic. People respect your boundaries without you demanding them. You speak less, but your words carry more weight. You no longer chase or explain, you exist, and that's enough. Conscious disconnection, ending the cycle of drain. Finally, Jung encouraged the conscious withdrawal of energy from relationships that no longer serve your evolution. This isn't done with hate, it's done with clarity. Not everyone who drains you is a villain, but not everyone who enters your life deserves a seat at your table. Letting go becomes a sacred act when done in service of wholeness. Jung might ask, is this relationship nourishing your soul or recycling your pain? Are you expanding or shrinking around this person? Does staying in this bond make you more or less yourself? And if the answer points to depletion, the most spiritual thing you can do is walk away, not in bitterness, but in self-respect. Part 8, turning energetic drain into spiritual awakening, the alchemy of self-transformation. Carl Jung believed that suffering wasn't a detour on the road to wholeness, it was the road. If someone is draining your energy, if you're exhausted, confused, and entangled in emotional chaos, it doesn't mean you're broken, it means something deeper is trying to wake you up. Energy-draining relationships are often the catalyst for individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. In fact, some of your greatest spiritual growth will come not from peaceful times, but from the emotional turmoil of being pulled into someone else's unconscious field and then finding the courage to return to your own center. In Jungian psychology, this isn't just healing, it's alchemy. It's taking the lead of your unconscious patterns and transmuting it into the gold of conscious awareness. The drainer as mirror, what their presence teaches you about you. Every person who drains your energy plays a symbolic role in your personal myth. They're not random. They appear because your psyche is trying to evolve, and it needs pressure to activate the transformation. From a Jungian point of view, they are not merely people, they are archetypal messengers. The narcissist who